44 days a year, the sun does not rise here, not barely rises, does not rise at all. The sky is black at noon. Outside, the temperature reads -50 degrees Celsius. The air, when you breathe it in, has a taste, a faint, sharp taste of sulfur. Because the city you are looking at, all by itself, produces approximately 1% of the world's sulfur dioxide emissions, and there is nowhere for that gas to go. There are 175,000 people living here. They go to school, they play hockey, they get married, and almost none of them, statistically, will ever leave. There is a story you have heard about Norilsk, most polluted city in Russia. That sentence is true. It is also the smallest part of what is going on here. This place was not built, it was sentenced into existence. In the next few minutes, 3 things. How a Soviet labor camp turned into a city of 175,000 people that the rest of Russia is not allowed to visit. Why the elegant neoclassical buildings in the city center were designed by men who were also prisoners there. And why most of the people who live in Norilsk today say they want to leave, and almost none of them do, and the reason has nothing to do with a wall. Norilsk sits on the Taymyr Peninsula in Russia's Krasnoyarsk Krai, 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, 2,400 kilometers from the North Pole. There is no road that connects Norilsk to the rest of Russia. There is no railway. In winter, when the Yenisei River freezes, the only way in or out is by air. Locals call the rest of the country simply the continent, as if they live offshore. They sort of do. Underneath them, in the rock, sits the largest known concentration of nickel, copper, and palladium ore on Earth. Roughly 1/3 of the world's known nickel reserves. About 41% of the planet's palladium output. Every electric car battery, every catalytic converter, every smartphone made anywhere in the world has a statistically real chance of containing metal that was pulled out of the ground in this exact place. And the reason the metal comes out of the ground at all is that, almost 100 years ago, the Soviet government decided that the cheapest way to extract it was with prisoners. Norilsk is a city. It is also a grave. Underneath what you see today are the remains of the people who built it. Subscribe to Impossible Lands, because the standard story about Norilsk, the one about pollution and acid rain and the most depressing city on Earth, leaves out the part that actually explains everything. The pollution is not the problem, the pollution is the design. In 1935, the Soviet state began the construction of Norillag, the Norilsk Corrective Labor Camp. A complex of barracks, mine shafts and processing facilities dropped into the tundra at the foot of the Puturan Mountains, 400 kilometers above the Arctic Circle. The first prisoners arrived that same year. There were 1,200 of them. 2 years later, with the start of the Great Purge in 1937, the number jumped to 9,000. By 1951, the camp held 72,500 prisoners simultaneously, spread across 30 separate camp sections. According to estimates by the Memorial Society, the human rights organization that has spent decades documenting the Soviet labor camp system, approximately 400,000 people passed through Norillag during its operational years. Roughly 300,000 of them were political prisoners. Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, anti-Soviet activity, was the most common charge. Many of those charges were fabricated. According to the official Norillag archives, 16,806 prisoners died inside the camp between 1935 and 1956, from cold, from starvation, from overwork, from accidents inside the mines. Independent estimates run higher. They lie today in mass graves at the foot of Mount Schmittig, on the southern edge of the city. The site has a name, the Norilsk Golgotha. On that hillside, slowly added over the years, are individual monuments erected by Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Ukrainian, and Jewish communities for their dead. Prisoners came from at least 23 different countries. They are buried together. The Polish memorial is a tilted railway track climbing a stone pyramid. At the top, the rails turn into crosses, leaning in different directions, like men shoved off balance. It is one of the most quietly devastating war monuments in Europe, and almost no one outside Russia has seen it. In 1939, Soviet architect Witold Niepokoicki was sent from Leningrad to take charge of designing a permanent city around Norillag. The neoclassical center of Norilsk that exists today, columns, pediments, the deliberate echo of St. Petersburg, was drawn up under his supervision. The architects who actually drafted the plans, Gevorg Kochar, Mikhail Mazmanyan, Olger Trushinch, were prisoners themselves. They designed Norilsk while they were inside it. The first thing they had to figure out was how to make the wind not kill people. Their first attempt, laying streets along the prevailing wind axis to let snow blow through, failed within one winter. They tried again. They tried a third time. Eventually they built the layout the city still uses today, a grid of low, solid blocks, each one breaking the wind for the next, like a defensive line of soldiers. The whole city is, in its bones, a windshield, drawn by men in prison uniforms. In March of 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Across the Soviet Union, prisoners waited to see if amnesty would come. It did, for some. The amnesty issued shortly after his death covered ordinary criminals and short-sentenced inmates. Political prisoners were specifically excluded. In Norilsk, the political prisoners were the majority. On the 26th of May, 1953, in Camp Number 4 of Gulag, the special camp for political prisoners attached to Norillag, the inmates stopped working. Within weeks, 6 camps were on strike. The total number of strikers, according to Soviet archival records, was 16,378 men and women. They had no weapons. Their tactics were non-violent. They wrote letters to the central government. They held hunger strikes. They raised black flags over their barracks. Trains carrying ore out of Norilsk left the city with strike slogans painted on the side. At one camp, the prisoners painted a single sentence on a long board and hung it where the townspeople of Norilsk could see it from the windows of their apartments. "We are being killed and starved." The strike lasted 69 days. It was the longest uprising in the history of the Soviet Gulag system. It ended on the 4th of August. MVD troops surrounded the last holdouts at Camp Number 3 and opened fire. Official Soviet records list 4 prisoners killed. Survivor testimony lists up to 150. Norillag was officially closed 3 years later, in 1956. Most of the surviving prisoners were released. A significant number stayed in Norilsk because they had nowhere else to go, and because the city around them, the city they had personally built, now needed workers. This is the first thing about Norilsk most people do not know. The city you see in photographs, the elegant pastel buildings, the Stalin-era columns, the wide avenues, was designed by prisoners and built on top of the unmarked graves of other prisoners. The descendants of the survivors are still there. Some of them still work in the same mines. The labor camp closed. The mining did not. By the 1960s, Norilsk nickel had become a strategic Soviet asset. By the 1980s, it was the largest single industrial polluter in the country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became one of the most valuable mining companies in the world. Today, Norilsk nickel produces almost a fifth of the world's high-grade nickel and roughly 41% of its palladium. Both metals are essential for modern electronics, for catalytic converters, and, increasingly, for the batteries that power the global transition away from fossil fuels. The same transition is supposed to reduce sulfur emissions worldwide. The mines that supply it are causing the largest non-volcanic sulfur dioxide plume on the planet. According to a long-running monitoring project led by NASA and Environment Canada, Norilsk nickel emits, on average, approximately 1.9 million tons of sulfur dioxide per year. To put that in proportion, that figure is roughly equal to the total annual sulfur dioxide output of the entire United States, from every car, every truck, every power plant, every factory, combined. Concentrated in a single city the size of Eugene, Oregon. The only sources on Earth that emit at this scale are erupting volcanoes. Volcanoes go quiet between eruptions. Norilsk has not gone quiet for almost 80 years. And here is the part that does not get said often enough. The pollution is not a side effect of the economy. The pollution is the economy. Reducing it meaningfully would mean reducing production. Reducing production would mean reducing the workforce. Reducing the workforce would mean closing the city. There is no engineering solution that delivers both clean air and a functioning Norilsk. The math does not exist. On the ground, what this means is something specific. The forests around the city are dead. By the early 1980s, satellite surveys confirmed that every larch tree within roughly 40 miles east of Norilsk had stopped producing new growth. Acid rain, falling on a thin tundra ecosystem, killed everything that was not already adapted to extreme cold and zero summer. What remains today is a circle of bleached gray skeletons. A petrified forest, except the petrification took 40 years instead of 40,000. Inside the city, Residents describe walking through visible pollution clouds in certain wind conditions. The clouds are described in the same way snow squalls are described elsewhere. You see one coming, you decide whether to walk through it or wait. If you walk through it, your eyes burn. According to public health data, life expectancy in Norilsk is approximately 10 years lower than the Russian national average. Cancer rates are roughly twice the national rate. Respiratory disease in children is, in some districts, twice as common as in others. The city has its own hospitals. It has its own cancer treatment center. The city is, in effect, designed around its own medical aftermath. None of this is hidden. The Russian Federal Statistics Service has officially classified Norilsk as the most polluted city in the country. Norilsk Nickel itself acknowledges what they call legacy issues. The company has, in recent years, invested billions of dollars in modernization programs aimed at reducing sulfur dioxide emissions. Those programs are real. They are also incremental. Even if they meet their targets, Norilsk will remain one of the largest single sources of industrial sulfur emissions on Earth. And then there is the city itself. Norilsk is the only major Russian city where the water and gas pipes run above the ground. They have to. The underlying soil is permafrost. Anything buried in it cracks the first time the surface layer thaws and refreezes. So the pipes run on stilts, in elevated steel cradles. Threading between apartment blocks like the city has been turned inside out, and you are looking at its skeleton. In late November, the sun stops rising. It does not rise again until mid-January. For up to 44 consecutive days, there is no daylight. The streetlights stay on 24 hours. Children go to school in the dark and come home in the dark. Doctors prescribe vitamin D the way doctors elsewhere prescribe paracetamol. Some residents describe a slow flatness that arrives in week 2 and does not lift until February. Then summer comes. The temperature gets above freezing. The smog gets worse because warm air traps the emissions over the city, and the geography of the 3 smelting plants surrounding the city center means that no matter which way the wind blows, the smoke comes home. And underneath all of this, there is the question almost no documentary about Norilsk actually answers honestly. Why are these people still here? The standard answer is money. The salary at Norilsk Nickel averages around $1,800 per month. The Russian national average is closer to 700. On paper, this is true. In practice, it is the trap. Buying an apartment in Krasnoyarsk, the regional capital 900 miles to the south, costs the equivalent of years of Norilsk savings. Buying anything in Moscow or St. Petersburg, where there is real work outside the mining sector, costs years more. The federal government runs a relocation program for residents of the far north. The waiting list runs into decades. People who applied in the 1990s are still waiting. Meanwhile, no new housing has been built in Norilsk since 2002. According to public reporting on government data, approximately 50% of the existing housing stock in the city has been classified as having structural deformations. About 1/3 of the population is officially considered at risk of losing their housing. As the permafrost beneath the foundations destabilizes from a combination of warming temperatures and decades of industrial heat from the city itself, Soviet-era apartment blocks tilt, crack, and in some cases have to be evacuated. Residents move into other Soviet-era apartment blocks that are slightly less tilted, until those tilt as well. The municipal government has identified roughly 100 buildings as requiring, in the mayor's words, special attention. In June of 2020, a fuel tank at a power plant on the edge of the city collapsed. Approximately 20,000 tons of diesel poured into the surrounding rivers and tundra. It was the largest land-based fuel spill in modern Russian history. The fine paid by a subsidiary of Norilsk Nickel was approximately $2 billion, the largest environmental penalty ever issued by the Russian state. The cause of the collapse was straightforward. The supports of the tank were anchored in permafrost. The permafrost, after decades of warming, partially driven by Norilsk's own emissions, thawed. The tank tilted. It split. The city is, in a slow and very literal sense, sinking into the consequences of its own existence. This is the third thing about Norilsk. Almost no one says clearly. The people there are not held in by a fence. They are held in by spreadsheets. Their salary is high enough to keep them inside the system and not high enough to buy them out of it. The doors are open. They cannot afford to walk through them. There is a Russian phrase for this kind of place, a trap that closes by paying you well. There is something almost unique about Norilsk. The city was founded as a prison, and it is still a kind of prison, but the bars have changed. They were physical from 1935 to 1956. They were political and bureaucratic from 1956 until 1991. They have been economic and structural since. The Norilsk Polar Drama Theatre is still operating today. It was founded in 1941 inside Norillag itself. The original troupe was made up almost entirely of prisoners. In the years right after the camp was closed, an actor named Innokenty Smoktunovsky, who would later become famous across the Soviet Union for playing Hamlet on screen, performed on that stage. He had just been released from a German prisoner of war camp. He arrived at the Norilsk Theatre because he could not get residency permission to live in any major Soviet city. Norilsk, the city no one else was allowed to enter, was one of the few places in Russia that would let a former prisoner stay. The theatre is still there. It still performs. The actors today are not prisoners. The audience today is not made up of camp guards. The seats are filled with miners, smelter workers, school teachers, doctors, and the children of those workers. Many of them are the great-grandchildren of the people who built the building they are sitting in. They are watching plays in a theater founded by a labor camp, in a city designed by political prisoners, on top of a mass grave, under a sky that has measurable amounts of industrial sulfur dioxide in it. On the night before, a shift in a mine that produces a metal essential to the global green economy. They go home, they sleep, they wake up. The next day, they go to work. That is what Norilsk actually is. Not a polluted Russian town, a continuous machine that started running in 1935 and has not stopped since. So here is the question that follows you out of this video. When the nickel deposits eventually run out, or the global market shifts, or the permafrost gives way completely under the foundations of a city that was never supposed to be permanent, what happens to the 175,000 people whose entire lives are tied to a place no one is allowed to enter and almost no one can afford to leave? There is no answer yet. There is only the date in the future when the question gets asked for real. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Impossible Lands.